Hi guys. So this is what I spent my morning doing before church, just mapping out this vision, this map of my study of Revelation chapter 21 on the new creation. This is for the Philip Project. So I'm looking at the new creation in Revelation chapter 21. I mapped out my 3 points, point 1, point 2, too much for one page, point 3 here. And I always begin with an introduction. I ask, why don't we just talk about heaven? Why do we need to use this Christianese term called the new creation? And I refer to pop culture references. If you watch a TV show like The Good Place, it's a place that has lots of free yogurt. And, it's a really, really colorful place. Why don't we just use a picture like that and what everyone understands as heaven, whereby we die and go up to this place called heaven. And I think the new creation, though, arguably is a much better way of describing what we're talking about when we talk about even heaven or Jesus' return, because it grounds, first of all, in the text that talks about how heaven comes down to us. We think we die, we go up to heaven, but heaven comes down to us. But secondly, it grounds in the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is a preview of our resurrection. It's a physical resurrection. It's a bodily resurrection. And the Bible actually says that we who are in Christ are this new creation. We are a preview of the things to come. So that's just the intro, and then I lead into the 3 points. The 3 points beginning with God's people, and then God's place, and finally God's king. It's a nice summary of the whole Bible, God's people and God's place under God's king. But it's also a summary of chapter 21. And I begin with how God's people are actually people, who are now, not just in the future, but who are now faithful to Jesus and are therefore suffering. It talks about God comforting them, wiping every tear from their eyes. And it's a word for us now, to persevere and to hold on, with the hope of heaven, yes, but God being with us now and God being with us even more fully in the end. And so God's people are those whom he loves, those whom he comforts, those whom he encourages to hold on to him. And that's a very interesting way to begin, because it doesn't begin very rosily in the future, whereby we're enjoying ourselves in heaven. It begins with us now, holding on to this hope. And God saying, I am with you. I'll always be with you. And I will be with you all the way to the end. So that's the first point about God's people. Secondly, God's place. And this is where we get into the descriptions of heaven, of the city, streets of gold, that sort of thing. And it describes it in two ways, numerically and aesthetically. And there are actually two different pictures here of actually God's people. And the point is that God's place is with his people. It's not describing a place, it's not describing a building, it's describing people who are beautiful to him. Numerically, because it uses the number 12 to symbolize the Old and New Testament peoples. It's saying that all of us, all who are redeemed in Christ, all of us have a place there. And God wants this whole people gathered around him at the end time. But secondly, aesthetically, uses lots of beauty, kind of like aesthetic language, especially with these jewels, 12 jewels adorning 12 foundations. And these 12 jewels, very interestingly, adorn this guy, this high priest that goes into the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament. Only one guy can do this. He represents all 12 tribes. That's why there are 12 jewels. But it's saying how we now have direct access to the Holy of Holies. The city is described as a cube, and the only cube in the Old Testament is this Holy of Holies where God dwells. Only 1% go in. We have direct access to this cube right now. It's saying that God's place is with his people. He wants us to have direct access to him. Or to put it a different way, it's saying God's people are the building. God's people, it's talking about the church. It's not talking about a physical building. It's not talking about how we need to be in the building in order to worship him. It's talking about how God has come to us in Christ, and therefore as we are gathered in him, we are his place. He dwells in us by his Spirit. And one day that will be physically true, that will be fully true. But even right now, if we realize that, even in lockdown, we are in the presence of God as we come together in Christ. So that's the second point about God's place. It's with us, people. But finally, God's king is talking about Jesus. Here it's described always as the Lamb, and the Lamb. And he's talking about a shift. There are two shifts that happen here in terms of God's glory. And it's one shift out and the other shift in. God's glory out, it now radiates out through the Lamb. It now radiates, back in verse 11, it talks about the glory of God in jasper. It's just so evident, the fact that God is there means you see his glory. And in the Old Testament, it's evidence that He's there. You can't actually look at God directly, but if you see His glory, that's Him. But here it talks about now the Lamb is its lamp, and this Lamb, this Jesus, this King, now reflects the full radiance and aura and presence of God. It's in Jesus. But secondly, there's that shift whereby we bring the glory in. It talks about the nations bringing the glory into the city. It talks about the kings bringing their splendor in the city. And it talks about this gates never being shut, meaning this glory in is continuous, it's never ending. It's always giving praise and glory and honor to Jesus. And it's talking about this relationship that will be never ending in heaven. We will be giving praise to God for all our lives into eternity for what Jesus has done for us on the cross. And it ends actually with those who won't be doing this. It ends with a warning in verse 27, nothing impure will enter it, nor will anyone that does anything that's shameful or deceitful. It's talking about those who reject God's glory knowingly. It's not just talking about people who don't know Jesus, who don't know God, but it's talking about actually people who do know Him, but refuse to do this. It's a parallel with verse 8, whereby it gives again a long list of people who reject God, who do commit idolatry and sexual immorality and like that. But it begins with the words cowardly and ends with the words liars. And this is mirroring verse 27, and ending with deceitful and beginning with shameful. And it's talking about those, you're cowardly if you're afraid to do something that you know is true. You're lying if you do something that's contrary to the truth. And it's therefore talking about people who know all this, who know that, that it's worthwhile worshiping God even though it's hard, and who know that God's place is with us, and know that Jesus is the center of God's glory, but don't do this, who refuse to do this even today. And He's saying that therefore, if you don't do this today, there won't be a place for you there tomorrow. Well, that's my 3 points. That's my summary. I'll try to put this together in some meaningful text, and maybe prepare this for the lecture that I have to give for the Philip project. Do it in some form or other. Maybe it's a video. Maybe if I'm lazy, this will be the video. Who knows? But anyway, this is what I did. It's Sunday morning. I just had church. It was really, really great to worship with everyone together. But again, just to remind ourselves that God. God is at the center of our worship. God is the center of what it means for us to gather together as His church. And His glory is seen in Jesus Christ. Look at Him, give all glory to Him. It is worth it. It is what we are doing now, is what we will do into eternity.